tiene ningún arma.
What happens when a cartel speedboat carrying millions in narcotics outruns every patrol vessel, yet forgets that the sky above is never empty? That question ignited one of the most dramatic interdictions in recent US Coast Guard history, an operation unfolding as global tensions ripple from Eastern Europe to the South China Sea. The clash between smugglers desperate for escape and the world's most experienced maritime law enforcement force became not just a regional story, but a lesson in modern power projection. At 1000 hours local time in the Eastern Pacific, a cartel go-fast boat was racing at nearly 50 knots. Fishing boats in those waters rarely exceed a fraction of that speed, but these weren't fishermen. Hidden beneath blue tarps was cargo worth an estimated $42 million on US streets, enough if delivered to fuel cartel operations stretching from Latin America to Europe. Each crewman expected to pocket millions money to vanish forever, yet their confidence masked a fatal miscalculation. Surveillance aircraft had already marked their wake hours before. Above the Pacific at 25,000 feet, a US HC-130J Super Hercules tracked the vessel. Its ANAPS-154 radar could scan hundreds of miles, identifying anomalies in speed and course. By 0800 hours, analysts noted the suspicious trajectory, no AIS transponder zigzag maneuvers inconsistent with commercial fishing. 3 red flags triggered a cascade of encrypted communications across Link 16, linking the Cutter Kimball Joint Interagency Task Force South and Key West, and even Drug Enforcement Administration liaisons monitoring cartel patterns. The smugglers, oblivious, thought the ocean offered freedom. Cartel reliance on speedboats is nothing new. Jane's Defense Weekly notes that between 2019 and 2024, go-fast interdictions accounted for nearly half of all maritime narcotic seizures in the Eastern Pacific. What changed is the precision of US detection. Unlike the chaotic chases of the past, today's operations combine satellite intelligence, aerial surveillance, and airborne strike capabilities in a seamless chain. Defense News recently observed that the Coast Guard now operates more like a joint force combatant command than a policing agency, an evolution underscored by the events of this chase. Context in 2025 makes the story even sharper. While US forces were engaging in support missions across NATO's eastern flank and deterring Chinese naval assertiveness around Taiwan, the Trump administration emphasized that cartel interdictions remain frontline national security. Reuters reported in August 2025 that cocaine shipments moving through maritime routes surged by nearly 20% compared to 2023, driven by new alliances between South American cartels and transnational networks in West Africa. This backdrop highlights why the Coast Guard remains stretched across multiple oceans, its cutters part law enforcement, part frontline defense asset. For NATO allies, the lesson is clear: criminal networks thrive on exploiting gray zones of security. Just as Russian forces adapt in Ukraine and Iranian proxies use asymmetric tactics in the Gulf cartels, apply speed secrecy and calculated risk in international waters. Western strategists increasingly view these narcotics runs as more than organized crime. They are parallel warfare destabilizing societies through addiction, corruption, and violence. The interdiction of this single boat carried weight far beyond its cargo. From the smuggler's perspective, the math seemed simple. 4 Mercury outboards at maximum throttle fuel tanks pushing limits a rendezvous point somewhere north. Yet physics was against them. The Hercules above monitored every zigzag. When the vessel stopped its evasive pattern and pushed straight north, analysts knew desperation had replaced calculation. Fuel consumption had outpaced planning. Each minute at 50 knots drained reserves they could not replenish. What appeared to the smugglers as bold defiance looked from the sky like inevitability. Western experts emphasize the symbolism. Former Royal Navy analyst Peter Roberts told DW this year, when a state can seamlessly coordinate air, sea, and intelligence assets against non-state actors, it sends a message not only to criminals, but to rival militaries. The tools of great power competition extend to every domain. That observation applies directly here. While Russia launches missile salvos in Ukraine and China rehearses blockades, the US demonstrated that it can still direct overwhelming precision against even the smallest threats without missing a beat on larger global fronts. So the chase was not merely cat and mouse, it was proof that no corridor of the Pacific, no matter how remote, lay beyond the reach of American surveillance. The smugglers calculating profit had walked straight into the jaws of an organization that had refined interdiction into near science. The question looming for viewers is this: if the US Coast Guard can dismantle a smuggling run with such coordination, how might these same tactics evolve if tensions with China or Iran spill further into open confrontation at sea? How does a cartel vessel barely the size of a fishing trawler become the center of a multinational intelligence network's attention? The answer lies in the silent but constant surveillance architecture circling above the world's oceans, where even the fastest boats leave signatures impossible to hide. In this case, it was the US Coast Guard's airborne assets that turned an ordinary smuggling run into a masterclass in maritime tracking. The HC-130J Super Hercules had been circling the skies since dawn, its AN/APS-154 advanced surveillance radar sweeping a 200-mile radius with precision. Analysts at consoles inside the aircraft marked anomalies, inconsistent speed, erratic zigzagging, and no identification transponder a clear violation of maritime norms. The decision was swift. This wasn't a fishing boat avoiding storms. This was a high-value cartel runner. With a few keystrokes, the information moved instantly through encrypted networks, cascading to the cutter Kimball hundreds of miles away, and to liaison teams at Joint Interagency Task Force South in Key West. Cartels have long relied on the tactic of blending into legitimate traffic, but as The Guardian noted earlier this year, the era of invisibility on the high seas is ending, replaced by digital footprints impossible to erase. The smugglers might have believed that their zigzag maneuvers made calculations harder for patrol craft, yet advanced electro-optical cameras and infrared sensors made every turn visible from 140 miles away. Through the Hercules Star Sapphire 380 HDC system, operators could literally count the number of outboards, see crewmen moving, and track every adjustment of the helm. The Coast Guard's doctrine in 2025 reflects lessons drawn not only from narcotics operations, but also from observing modern conflict zones. DW analysts point out how Ukraine's innovative use of drones against Russian naval units in the Black Sea has underscored the importance of persistent aerial reconnaissance. In the Pacific, similar lessons are being applied. Surveillance isn't merely about detection, but about shaping adversary decisions. By locking onto the smugglers early, the Coast Guard forced them into a battle of attrition they could never win. Inside, the go-fast calculations were very different. 4 Mercury 300 horsepower engines, each burning about 25 gallons of fuel per hour at full throttle, meant that every hour drained their reserves dangerously close to empty. They carried perhaps 400 gallons total. 2 hours had already passed, meaning they had only 2 left at best. Yet their rendezvous point remained 3 hours away. What they viewed as bold resistance was in reality a countdown to immobilization. The Kimball, though 200 miles away and cruising at only 28 knots, didn't need to overtake them directly. The calculus was simple. The smugglers would run dry, but waiting wasn't the plan. Airborne interception was already in motion. From the cutter's deck, an MH-65E Dolphin helicopter roared into the sky's engines, delivering 853 shaft horsepower, climbing to 3,000 feet to conserve fuel before diving toward the intercept zone. This helicopter wasn't a standard search and rescue craft. It was modified for Interdiction, part of the elite helicopter Interdiction Tactical Squadron Hytron. Since its inception in 1998, Hytron has conducted over 500 successful interdictions, stripping cartels of billions in contraband. Defense News highlighted in May 2025 that Hytron's success rate makes it the most effective counter-narcotics aviation program in the world, with interdiction value estimated at over 16 billion seized. Each deployment of a Hytron bird signals that negotiations will only last so long before steel and firepower speak. As the MH-65E closed the gap, pilots relied on an advantage that boats could never replicate: three-dimensional maneuverability. While the smugglers zigzagged every few minutes to throw off surface intercepts, the helicopter simply cut straight lines between projected intercept points, saving time and fuel. It was chess against checkers, and the cartel crew veterans of 18 previous runs found themselves suddenly amateurs. But this drama wasn't unfolding in a vacuum. Western intelligence agencies warned that the techniques perfected here may prove vital in much larger contests. A senior NATO maritime strategist told Reuters this summer, every interdiction against cartels doubles as rehearsal for potential peer state confrontations. The command and control tested here is directly applicable to deterring Chinese maritime militias or Iranian smuggling flotillas in contested waters. In short, today's drug bust is tomorrow's battlefield drill. By late morning, the smugglers could already hear the distant thrum of rotor blades. First came the hurricane of downwash, then the booming voice of a long-range acoustic device. This is the United States Coast Guard. Stop your vessel immediately. Commands blasted in English and Spanish at a staggering 162 decibels louder than a rocket launch. Still, the Go Fast did not falter. 5 men weighed down by millions in cargo and facing potential decades in federal prison gambled everything on reaching friendly waters. That gamble was already lost. What began as a narcotics run was now a showdown between desperation and inevitability. And the question that hangs over this moment is stark. How long can raw Defiance hold when precision technology and relentless pursuit close in from every angle? What happens when Defiance meets overwhelming firepower? That question defined the next phase of the chase as the smugglers rejected every warning, forcing the US Coast Guard to escalate step by step. Compliance is always the preferred outcome, but in the world of high-speed narcotics, run stubbornness can be just as dangerous as the contraband itself. The MH-65E helicopter had maneuvered into a standoff position 500 meters astern of the fleeing Go Fast. From here, pilots remained out of range of small arms, but close enough to unleash every tool in their arsenal. The compliance phase began with protocols designed to minimize risk, hand signals, flashing lights, and finally the LRAD acoustic cannon. At 162 decibels, its commands, "Stop your vessel." "Prepare for boarding" were unmistakable, carried in both English and Spanish. Spray and rotor wash battered the smugglers' deck, transforming their desperate sprint into chaos. Yet the men below remained defiant. Inside the cockpit, pilots knew the decision tree was tightening. Under US rules of engagement in international waters, the refusal to comply after warnings justified escalation. Authorization flowed swiftly from the cutter. Kimball warning shots were cleared. The side-mounted M240B machine gun, capable of firing 650 rounds per minute, erupted with tracer fire. Bright streaks hammered the ocean just meters from the Go Fast bow, each burst a vivid reminder that surrender remained an option. But adrenaline and desperation clouded judgment. The smugglers leaned harder on the throttle's engine, screaming as the boat jinked violently left, then right. To them, evasion felt like a lifeline. To the pilots, it was theater. The helicopter could pivot far faster than any vessel could maneuver. This was more than a tactical exchange. It echoed the cat-and-mouse struggles unfolding elsewhere in 2025. In the Black Sea, Russian units had been using zigzagging missile boats to evade Ukrainian drones. In the Gulf, Iranian smugglers often raced through contested waters, ignoring coalition warnings until warning fire forced compliance. These parallels underline a core reality. Whether in criminal operations or state-backed provocations, small vessels often gamble on hesitation. The Coast Guard, hardened by hundreds of such encounters, had no hesitation left. With 3 bursts of warning fire ignored, escalation became unavoidable. The helicopter's gunner transitioned from the M240B to a far more surgical weapon, the Barrett M107 chambered in 50 BMG. This rifle, weighing 30 pounds and firing rounds at 853 meters per second, was designed for one purpose: disabling engines with precision fire. Hitron gunners are among the most elite marksmen in the Coast Guard, trained not just as snipers, but as specialists in firing from moving platforms in turbulent seas. The mission now shifted from persuasion to neutralization. Each outboard engine represented a fragile target aluminum blocks vulnerable to the kinetic force of 50 caliber fire. By disabling propulsion rather than sinking the vessel, the Coast Guard ensured evidence remained intact while minimizing risk of casualties. Western experts highlight the sophistication behind this escalation model. A 2025 analysis by Defense News notes, Hitron embodies a philosophy of controlled lethality where the threat is neutralized with surgical precision rather than overwhelming destruction. This approach mirrors broader NATO doctrine in contested waters, where de-escalation through precision remains a guiding principle. Whether against cartel smugglers or maritime militias, the goal is not indiscriminate firepower, but calibrated dominance. From a strategic perspective, the refusal of the smugglers carries a warning of its own. Criminal organizations emboldened by billions in profit often adopt tactics resembling military resistance. And just as NATO forces confront defiance from adversaries unwilling to yield, be it in Ukraine, the Gulf, or the Taiwan Strait, the Coast Guard finds itself in miniature versions of the same struggle. As The Guardian commented in July, cartel interdictions are shadows of larger conflicts, reminders that persistence against Western forces often ends the same way, with technology and training overwhelming bravado. The stage was set. Smugglers, clutching at fading hope, had chosen confrontation. Above them, the helicopter's gunner settled into rhythm, every breath synchronized with rotor vibrations and ocean swells. Compliance was off the table. What came next was the surgical dismantling of their escape. The question for the audience is simple but haunting. Once warnings fail and Defiance hardens, how far should American forces go to ensure that justice is delivered at sea? How do you stop a vessel racing across the ocean at nearly 50 knots, its engine screaming, its crew desperate, its cargo worth millions? The answer is as simple as it is brutal. You take away its heart. That is exactly what the US Coast Guard's elite Hitron gunner prepared to do. From the MH-65E Dolphin's cabin, the Barrett M10750 BMG rifle rested against the shoulder of a marksman trained for this precise scenario. Unlike ordinary snipers, Hitron gunners are specialists who shoot from a vibrating, moving helicopter at targets that are themselves bouncing across waves. The training pipeline is merciless. Candidates fire thousands of rounds in live sea conditions, synchronizing breath, trigger squeeze, and helicopter sway until hitting an engine block from hundreds of meters becomes second nature. Defense News recently reported that Hitron's shooters average a 90+% success rate on first shots, a staggering figure given the complexity of the task. The first round struck the starboard outer engine. In an instant, the Mercury powerhead disintegrated fragments of aluminum spraying into the wake. The Go Fast lurched as speed fell from 50 knots to just over 30. Smoke and oil clouded the sea, the smugglers clinging to the hope that 3 engines might still carry them clear. The second shot erased that hope. A round punched through the port outer engine, shredding fuel lines and seizing the pump. The boat slowed further, its rooster tail shrinking to a weak froth. Inside, panic must have spread every calculation of profit. Every plan to vanish was unraveling with each deafening crack of rifle fire. By the third shot, precision had become artistry. The bullet entered the starboard inner engine's lower unit and tore out through the top scattering parts into the sea. Now reduced to a crawl at barely 12 knots, the vessel wallowed helplessly in the swells. The fourth and final shot ended the contest altogether. The last Mercury exploded under the impact. The aluminum casing shredded the roar of engines, replaced by silence. Dead in the water, the smuggler's flight was over. This sequence was not merely tactical, it was strategic theater. Western analysts often emphasize how the United States demonstrates its capabilities in small, highly visible operations. A former NATO maritime officer told BBC earlier this year, every interdiction sends 2 messages to criminals that profit cannot outrun precision, to rivals that even in low-intensity missions, American forces execute with a professionalism that scales to high-end warfighting. In other words, the Coast Guard's surgical strike on a narco boat resonates from cartels in Latin America to naval planners in Moscow, Tehran, and Beijing. Parallel lessons are visible elsewhere. In Ukraine, drones have been used to disable Russian patrol boats with pinpoint accuracy, underscoring how precision, not volume of fire, reshapes naval warfare. In the Persian Gulf, US and allied forces employ similar controlled force against Iranian smuggling dhows, disabling engines without escalating into lethal clashes. Across regions, the principle is constant immobilize rather than annihilate, prove dominance while preserving evidence and limiting escalation. For the smugglers adrift in the Pacific, all that remained was dread. Their cargo was intact but worthless. Their engines destroyed their vessel, transformed from predator to floating wreck. The helicopter maintained overwatch, circling above like a hawk over prey, ensuring no escape attempt could succeed. On the horizon, the cutter Kimball launched its boarding team's rigid hull inflatable boats, tearing across the swells at 40+ knots. Cartel bosses might dismiss one lost shipment as the cost of doing business, yet experts argue the psychological effect is profound. According to Jane's Defense Weekly, the average cost of a fully outfitted Go Fast is several $1 million, and with crews arrested, networks disrupted, and contraband destroyed, the blow reverberates through supply chains. It is not just money lost, but confidence shaken, and when confidence falters, control fractures. Here, in one decisive volley of rifle fire, the Coast Guard had rewritten the smuggler's fate. The chase was over, the interdiction secured, but the drama was not finished. What happened next would showcase the human dimension of maritime special operations, the tense, dangerous moment of boarding an enemy vessel at sea. The question now arises once the engines are silent and the fugitives trapped. How do elite boarding teams ensure control without triggering violence in those final perilous seconds? How do you board a hostile vessel at sea when its crew is desperate, armed, and standing over millions in contraband? The answer lies in precision, coordination, and overwhelming presence, the hallmarks of the US Coast Guard's tactical law enforcement teams, better known as TACLET South. From the cutter Kimball, two 7-meter rigid hull inflatable boats, RHIBs slammed into the waves, their 470 horsepower diesel screaming as they accelerated to 45 knots. Each boat carried 6 operators armed with M4A1 carbine sidearms and less lethal tools. They wore body armor with flotation plates, helmets rigged with comms, and gear designed for the unforgiving ocean environment. These weren't ordinary patrolmen, they were maritime special operators trained in opposed boardings where hesitation can mean death. The RHIBs approached in a pincer maneuver, one cutting across the smuggler's bow, the other sliding toward the stern. Waves crashed against fiberglass hulls as coxswains timed every movement to keep formation. From 10 meters out, the first operator stood in the bow pistols leveled at the 5 stunned men on deck. Spanish commands rang out over the roar of engines. Manos arriba, no se muevan. Hands up, don't move. Caught between 2 assault teams, the smugglers froze. Tarps covering nearly 3,000 pounds of cocaine shifted in the wind, a stark reminder of what was at stake. On one side, freedom was gone. On the other, U.S. federal prison sentences loomed up to 20 years apiece. Slowly, hands went skyward, then the crew dropped to their knees, forced forward until they lay belly down on the deck. Plastic flex cuffs clicked shut one by one, and the RHIB team swept the vessel with disciplined precision. But the Coast Guard's job did not end with arrests. The vessel itself, a stateless craft under maritime law, had to be eliminated to prevent reuse or recovery by accomplices. Operators spread accelerant across the deck, then ignited a flare. Within minutes, flames consumed the fiberglass hull. What had been a multi-million-dollar cartel investment became an inferno visible for miles, a message written in smoke and fire. As The Guardian reported in a 2025 analysis, every burned vessel is not just destruction of property, but a signal to traffickers the ocean is not yours. While the crew was ferried back to the cutter for processing, intelligence teams immediately cataloged cargo communications equipment and GPS logs. These details feed into wider networks mapping cartel supply chains stretching from Colombian jungles to Mexican ports and even to African transit hubs. Western intelligence agencies emphasize that every interdiction offers more than a drug bust, it's a puzzle piece in dismantling global criminal economies. From a broader perspective, this operation exemplifies how law enforcement and military practice blur at sea. NATO strategists increasingly point to U.S. interdictions as rehearsal for contested operations elsewhere. If a dozen Coast Guard operators can subdue armed smugglers on a pitching boat, the same tactics scale upward for dealing with hostile militias, privateers, or even state-backed proxies. DW analysts note parallels with recent Israeli interdictions of Iranian arms shipments to Syria operations where speed, precision, and restraint were equally vital. President Trump has repeatedly framed these missions as frontline national security, warning that cartel alliances with transnational groups risk becoming as destabilizing as terror networks. The BBC echoed this view in August 2025, reporting that cartel-linked revenues are increasingly funneled into arms trafficking and political destabilization across Latin America. For Washington, allowing a single shipment through is more than a domestic drug issue, it risks empowering adversaries abroad. The psychological dimension cannot be understated. For cartels, losing cargo is costly. Losing face is catastrophic. Every crewman arrested becomes a liability. Every destroyed boat a public symbol of failure. The flames licking skyward from that burning hull were more than disposal. They were a statement. Yet, as decisive as the boarding appeared, it leaves a question for the future in an era where criminal organizations adopt tactics resembling paramilitary forces. How can the US and its allies prepare for the day when smugglers are not just desperate but fully militarized? What lessons can the world's most powerful maritime force draw from a single smuggling run? The answer lies not only in the seizure of drugs or the arrest of 5 traffickers, but in the broader strategic meaning of operations like this. Each interdiction is more than a law enforcement success. It is a rehearsal, a warning, and a demonstration of power at a time when the oceans are increasingly contested. With the smugglers detained and their vessel consumed by flames, the cutter Kimball resumed its patrol. But behind the dramatic images of rifles firing, helicopters hovering, and boats boarding lay a web of intelligence coordination and doctrine honed over decades. Since 1998, Hitran crews have neutralized over 500 cartel vessels, stripping an estimated $16.7 billion in narcotics from transnational networks. That is not just crime fighting, it is strategic disruption of organizations that operate like shadow states, undermining governments from Central America to Europe. In 2025, this disruption takes on even greater meaning. Cartels are no longer isolated gangs. They operate with the sophistication of insurgencies, forming alliances with armed groups and exploiting global instability. Reuters recently reported how cartels have used conflict zones in West Africa as transit hubs, moving cocaine through fragile states where governance barely exists. Al Jazeera, in a July investigation, noted intelligence suggesting cartels' trade routes now intersect with smuggling networks tied to Iranian proxies, raising concerns that profits could be funneled into financing hostile militias. The Coast Guard's mission, therefore, is not a side note to great power competition, it is part of it. NATO strategists are watching closely. DW analysts draw a direct link between US interdictions in the Pacific and NATO patrols in the Mediterranean, where similar fast boats ferry migrants and contraband under the cover of chaos. For the Alliance, the Coast Guard's ability to combine air, sea, and intelligence assets against asymmetric threats provides a model for maritime security in contested waters from the Baltic to the Black Sea, as one Western defense expert told Jane's Defense Weekly in September 2025. The message is unmistakable. If America can find and disable a go-fast in the Pacific, it can just as easily disable an armed militia craft in the Gulf or a Chinese maritime militia vessel in the South China Sea. For Washington, the narrative is clear. President Trump has publicly linked counter-narcotics with national defense, calling drug cartels the silent invasion force undermining American society. His administration has tied interdiction budgets to broader defense appropriations, underscoring that what happens in the Eastern Pacific connects directly to what happens in Ukraine, Israel, or the Taiwan Strait. The operational logic is the same: detect early, disrupt decisively, and demonstrate dominance. The data speaks volumes. According to the U.S. Southern Command, maritime interdictions in the Eastern Pacific prevented more than 200 tons of cocaine from reaching American streets in the past year alone. Each ton represents thousands of lives affected, billions in criminal revenue denied, and networks fractured. Beyond numbers, these victories project resolve. They show allies that the U.S. can act decisively, and they remind adversaries, whether state or non-state, that speed and secrecy no longer guarantee safety. But with success comes a warning. Criminal groups adapt just as state adversaries do. Smugglers may adopt drones for reconnaissance, autonomous vessels for delivery, or heavier armaments to deter boardings. The next interdiction might not involve frightened traffickers, but hardened fighters. That possibility raises urgent questions for NATO and the West. How should maritime forces prepare for smugglers who evolve into militias, or militias that masquerade as smugglers? The burning hull of that go-fast may have slipped beneath the Pacific, but the ripple effect continues. For every interdiction like this, strategy evolves, lessons spread, and adversaries adjust. The ocean, vast and unyielding, is both highway and battlefield. The Coast Guard's victory reminds us that dominance at sea is not guaranteed by size alone, but by vigilance, precision, and the will to act. So the final question remains: as cartels grow bolder and global conflicts intensify, will future interdictions remain policing actions, or are they rehearsals for the next great naval confrontation? The interdiction of a cartel go-fast boat in the Eastern Pacific began as a high-speed narcotics run and ended as a demonstration of U.S. maritime dominance. At 1000 hours, smugglers thought they were invisible, but surveillance aircraft had already locked on, guiding the cutter Kimball and its hit-run helicopter into position. Despite warnings blasted at deafening volume, the crew refused to surrender. Escalation followed: first warning fire from an M240, then surgical strikes from a Barrett 50 caliber rifle that destroyed all 4 engines. Immobilized, the smugglers could only watch as Coast Guard operators closed in. Within minutes, they were handcuffed, their vessel aflame, their cargo seized. Beyond the drama, the operation carried strategic weight. It highlighted how cartels now operate with the sophistication of armed groups linking global crime to great power competition. Western analysts see these interdictions as rehearsals for higher stakes clashes, whether in the Black Sea, the Gulf, or the South China Sea. For the United States and NATO, the lesson is clear: the same precision that cripples a smuggler's boat can cripple adversary vessels in future wars. The ocean remains the ultimate battlefield, and the question is whether the next interdiction will be crime fighting or conflict